Thanks, Alan, and thank you all for coming. And unfortunately, I lost my watch, so I have to look at my phone, which is very unprofessional, but I'm going to keep track of time that way as best I can. Can you hear me? Does this work if I project a little bit? Okay. And I'm going to read some poems from Post, and I'm just going to jump in. The Debt. He entered through the doorway of his debt. Workmen followed, bringing box after box until everything he'd gathered in his life inhabited his debt. He opened the sliding door to the yard. A breeze blew through the spaces of his debt, blew the bills from the table onto the floor. The grove of birches and farther the beach of driftwood and broken shells were framed by the enormous window, that lens-like architectural focus of his debt. He drove into town on the coiled springs of his debt. When he bought fish at the market, he proffered his MasterCard. The dark woods stretching inland were pocked by light-filled cubes of debt. The very words he used to describe his surroundings were glittering facets of debt. Each visit we smoked on the deck, and over drinks he reminded me with love and genuine pride, one day all this debt would be mine. In this book, there are a number of poems that I call post-elegies, and I sort of imagine a post-elegy to be, well, let me put it this way. My dad died in 2008, and the post-elegies are, I think of them as sort of the way in which sort of, elegy sort of resonates in the imagination. So these are sort of written when a loss is no longer acute, but you're sort of still sort of bouncing up against it. And so that's another way of saying that none of these poems are exactly about my dad, but are sort of deflected or refracted ideas of that kind of loss. I should also say that when I was writing a lot of the poems in this book, I was flying a lot. I just was always flying in and out of, at the time, Kansas City, Missouri, where I used to live. And so there are a lot of planes in this book. And this poem happened when I was parking my car, as I often did in long-term parking, and I realized that if my plane went down, someone would have to go get my car. So that's sort of how this poem happened. It's called Post-Elegy. After the plane went down, the cars sat for weeks in long-term parking. Then, one by one, they began to disappear from among the cars of the living. When we went to retrieve his, you drove the rows of the lot while I pushed the panic button on the fob. Inside, a takeout coffee cup sat in its cradle, a skim of decay floating beneath the lid. I'd ridden in his car many times, but never driven it. When I turned the key, the radio opened unexpectedly like an eye. I was conscious of the ground passing just beneath the floor, and the trapped air and the tires lifting my weight. I realized I was steering homeward the down payment of some house we might live in for the rest of our lives. So I have two kids, one of whom is 5 and one of whom is 2, and they're almost 2. And I wrote this poem about that first, a lot of students here probably don't have kids, but that first year with a new baby is, people say it's lovely, but it's pretty awful. You sort of don't sleep, your child is useless and vaguely interacts with you, and it's just not great. So this poem is about that first year, and this poem came out in a journal like a month before my second child was born. I remember looking at the poem in the journal and thinking, oh God, what is going to happen next? And I forgot about this. This is the first year. It's in 2 sections. 1. The new parents rose to throw stone after stone into the pond. The moonlight barely touched them. The surface erupted with sound every time it was breached. All those stones planted in that pressurized dark at the bottom of the pond, the temperature dropping, the water beginning to ice. When the first stone hit and didn't sink, they stopped their throwing to observe the stones still with them in the silent air. 2. Meanwhile, indiscernibly, the water was draining through a buried system of pipes. They tossed their stones onto the ice, each skittered to an unreachable place. That long winter, the ice covered with stones kept lowering until at last it rested on the mud and the stones they'd thrown those months ago. Then the sun began to rise and the ice began to melt, and it was spring. Post-Elegy 1. For 4 years I kept your ashes in the trunk of my car. They rode with me to work and back home along the highway's greased tube of air. Someone would say, what a perfect American burial. Evenings I pushed the remote and the garage door unsealed like the door of a crematory. Then all night the day's accumulated heat slipped out of you. I never even removed the box from its postal packaging. 2. Finally, I took the box of ashes to the beach, where once I'd watched you swim, drunk in the turbulent aftermath of a hurricane. I dumped the dust at the lip of the waves, and they swallowed it up. It was easy as that. The mind sliding around inside the body like a clot, now lodged in the tapping foot, now in the groin, now fanned out in the hand on the book. Meanwhile, the foot still taps. What does it have to do with anything? And the sunflowers sliding past beyond the glass, the mind for an instant catches a path between the rows, then lets it go. Now a bridge, and the water arriving to comb the undershadow, the mind slipping over and onward. And the billow of strangers' voices, how the mind dips into their language like a nib into ink, then the conductor jangles past the mind. And that face in the glass, face with the fields sliding through it, face that is how the mind has come to think about itself. Okay, so this next poem is, this is a little bit of a spoiler, but it's gonna become clear at the end that the person who's speaking is a teacher speaking to a room of young students. And at a certain point, those students are gonna start to talk back to him and not, and sort of argue with him. So when that starts to happen, I'm gonna like hold up my finger and you're gonna know that this kid is talking, it's no longer the same voice, right? This is called The People's History. And I should also say that the word people is always capitalized in this poem, so there's a kind of intentional blurring of sort of who the people are. What else? I wrote this poem when I saw footage of a big, on TV, a big kind of, I think it was in California, there was some sort of big march and it erupted into rioting, and this is maybe 5 or 6 years ago. And I had this moment where the people who were marching were chanting something like, "We are the people," and it occurred to me that though I was very sympathetic to the cause that they were marching for, I also found that there was something a little unnerving for me about sort of claiming that these were the people, implying that the people they disagreed with were sort of not people, which was a little bit off-putting to me. So anyway, this is about that. It's called The People's History. The people moved up the street in a long column like a machine boring a tunnel. They sang the people's songs. They chanted the people's slogans. We are the people, not the engines of the city. We, the people, will not be denied. Then the people descended upon the people, swinging hardwood batons heavy with the weight of the people's intent. And the people surged then into the rows before them, pushing the people against the blurred arcs of truncheons, the people throwing rocks into the plastic shields and visors, behind which the people blinked when the rocks hit, then pushed back so the mass of people before them compressed. In the windows above the street, the people looked down and thought, thank God we're not the people trapped now in the confines of those bodies. And soon the people on rooftops loaded their rifles with wax bullets, which looked like earplugs, which the people had produced in factories full of people flanking machines designed by the people. When the bullets buried themselves in the people cried, those shooters are not the people. Some piece of them has been removed like a fuse. The true people are a surface that floats on the sea of our fathers. How they buoy us, the people shouted. But the people had grown tired of the afternoon and released dogs into the crowd, dogs that could not tell the people from the people, and the people fled in all directions back into the city, singing with pain. And now, children, when we meet the people in the market, how will we know them? Their clubs and their bruises, their language of power. What about concepts? They fill them with bodies. And weapons, they spend hours piecing them together. What else? They open their mouths. And what else? Nothing. They open their mouths. Is that wrong? Excuse me, but what gives us the right to define them? That's not what I'm saying. Excuse me, but aren't we too the people? Yes, but wiser. But sir, how can the surface be different from the sea? All the poems in this book are downers, so you know, every one of them. It's a really sad book. I feel a little bad reading it to people because here's a little sonnet. It rhymes, but you might not be able to hear that when I read it. Image psychotherapy. I should say, too, that my wife is a psychotherapist, so this is sort of, this comes from many conversations where she comes home and tells me her stories about working with clients, which I think technically she's not supposed to do. Image psychotherapy. The ship is so close to shore, it seems ridiculous it can't be righted. Every day it slips a little more. The rooftop pool has poured its water into the sea. The stack's mouths dip below the tide, water inside an engine already underwater. It feels like I should be able to reach out and shift the rudder on its massive hinge, lift the ship back into its buoyancy. Even here, on this shelf past the lip of town, it's impossible to have any real sense of its scale. So I mentioned that I lived in Kansas City, Missouri. I lived there for 12 or 11 years, and 1 year in this really not awesome town of Warrensburg, Missouri, where I taught. And then I started commuting out. So I had this long commute each way. And finally, I'd gotten this job in Denver. I knew that I was going to be moving to Denver. This was my last 2 months doing this commute that I'd done, 110 miles round trip that I did for 11 years. And it was worth it to not live in that town. And so in the last 2 months, there was a highway shooter in the Grandview Triangle that I would have to drive through every day to go to work. And I would be in the car with my daughter in the back seat, taking her out to preschool, and this guy shot into I think it was 11 cars, shot 9 people in a month. And so I felt like, this was a clear sign that I really was making the right decision leaving Missouri. But then, and then on top of that, then that same month in the town that I was teaching in, there was a guy who was trying to go into the high school with a shotgun to shoot up the high school. He got deterred and ran away in his car and ended up committing suicide in the parking lot next to the English department. So it was a really loaded month full of activity with guns. So this poem is sort of about that. And it's worth mentioning, in case this isn't clear when you're sort of hearing the poem, that pretty much everything that's happening in this poem, it's never quite clear what's real and what's sort of in the imagination of the speaker as he's sort of fearful and paranoid about, maybe rightfully so, about what's going on around him. So this is called Ballad, American 21st Century. And it's also in rhyming quatrains, but the rhyme shifts around in each quatrain. Ballad, American 21st Century. That spring the shooter was everywhere. Shot from our minds into the hedgerows, the pickup beds and second-floor windows, the hillocks and tentacled live oaks. And sometimes he was tracking us with the dilated pupil at the tip of his rifle. His bullets spun into the theater stop sign faces, the tessellated car lots beyond the exits. They tore holes in our restaurants and vinyl siding, those fiberglass teacups we clambered into at the county fair. Though you don't remember it, little bear, a bullet crossed right in front of your car seat. Then window glass covered you like bits of clouded ice, and the rain came pouring in as I raced for shelter at the Wendy's off exit 10. Every night we kept the curtains drawn, and while your mother slept, I sat alone in the bathroom dark watching the news surface into the ice-cut window of my cell phone. They said the shooter was in St. Louis shooting up a middle school gym. Then he'd gone to the beach where he killed a girl pouring sand from a cup into a sandwich tin. Nevertheless, I pictured his face as a cloud of insects hovering in the blackest corner of the empty lot across the street. At work, they walked us through scenarios, what to throw if he came through my classroom door, how to arm the students' desks for counterattack. And when he came, and when those next 4 people were erased, they trapped him in a high-speed chase toward the touchless car wash, where the cops encircled him, and rather than relent, he put his rifle barrel to his mouth like the mouth of a test tube from some childhood experiment. I'm just going to read 2 more, if I can find them. They're somewhere in here. Here we go. So my wife likes to say that people are clearly not meant to be monogamous, but they're also clearly too selfish not to be monogamous. And so, that's sort of the difficulty, right? So this poem is sort of my articulation of that in some ways. But I also, a friend of mine from Belfast is here. I wrote this poem when I was in Northern Ireland, and my first 2 months there, it was like 33.5 degrees and poured rain for 2 months. It was like the most oppressive weather I've ever dealt with. I realize the Northern Irish Cultural Council is like not happy that I'm selling this as a good vacation destination. It gets much nicer when it's not January, but and I had a 2-year-old, and so we were trapped in this little apartment, with sort of not a lot of opportunities to get out. And so this poem, I think, sort of also comes out of that sort of claustrophobic environment. This is called Marriage. I was walking away. As I moved, I knew you were sleeping in our bed. I was pushing through time, aware of it as I slid toward another world that seemed enveloped by the sheath of an indecipherable hum. Cupped inside that moment, I began to surface, a sense of rising, the earth I could feel lifting with me toward a blurred layer in the sky through which the ground, the street, the windows passed, and see, I arrived at the warm engine of you asleep beside me. And this is a mean thing to do. I'm going to read one more poem, but it's in 12 sections. Luckily, those sections are really short. They're like a line each. I remember going to a reading once and seeing someone do that, and then they actually read like a 12-section poem that took about 25 more minutes, and it was brutal. There's a glimmer of hope at that last poem, right? So these are short sections. This poem is called On Language, but it also could be called On Marriage. It's sort of thinking about the ways in which what marriages live on language or something like that. On Language. 1. There were only certain stones we could step on to cross the river. 2. The stones we could step on to cross the river were not certain. 3. It was difficult to decide if the stones were part of the river or a scattered resistance to the river, if the stones were form or content inside the greater form of river. 4. Mainly the stones we stepped on dropped away behind us like the notes of a song. 5. A lovely village lay across the river, but we spent most of our time focused on the stones. When at last we arrived at the muddy bank, the village had shifted impossibly back across the river. 6. Love, stay with me inside the syntax of the river. 7. At times, the stones we stepped on were at the bottom of the river. When we emerged, our bodies no longer sails in the current. The stones had risen like balloons to the river's ceiling. 8. Those days, the river filled our clothes, our ears slicked us like a dream. 9. We sat on the shoreline and looked back across the river we again would have to cross. Looking, too, was a kind of crossing. 10. Inside the forever descending current of the river, a counter-moving archipelago of stones. 11. Stones that we discovered crossed the river. 12. We spent our days crossing and crossing the river. Thank you.
Thanks, Wayne. That was great. So now Henry Israeli, who's sitting right over there, is our next reader tonight. Henry's poetry collections include New Messiahs, Praying the Black Cat, and God's Breath Hovering Across the Waters, which is back there as well. So if you pick one up, go ahead and do so and get a sign later on. He is the translator of Fresco, the selected poetry. I'm going to let you say the poet's name. Thank you. I would have destroyed that. Child Nature and Haywire, new and selected poems. He has received fellowships from the National Endowment for the Arts, Canada Council on the Arts, and elsewhere. His poetry and translations have appeared in numerous journals, including American Poetry Review, Boston Review, Harvard Review, the Iowa Review, the Literary Review, Tin House, Fence, and Verse, as well as several anthologies. Henry is also the founder and editor of Saturnalia Books. He is Associate Teaching Professor of English and Associate Director of the Certificate in Writing and Publishing program at Drexel University here in Philly. So please give it up for Henry.
Thanks, Alan, and thanks for coming out. In case you thought you were going to get a break from downer poems. So my book is about the death of my mother in 2009. So we're quite a pair here. But I'm going to start with I'll start with a little palate cleanser. So a newer poem that is not from the book. Well, I'll just read it. It's called Blame the French. Because why not? 1. Whatever you do, the French did first. Whatever you say, the French said first. Whatever you wear, the French wore first. You see the pattern? There's nothing in life that the French did not do first. Nothing. Can you think of anything? Wrong. The French did it first. Say what? The French already said that. You saw something original in a film once? Then you never saw Renoir or Cocteau. You read something? Zola, Baudelaire, Rimbaud, de Beauvoir, take your pick. Food? Don't even go there, wise guy. You had a dream after which you awoke, amazed at the veracity of your complicated mind? Get over yourself. The French dreamt it long before you. Everything you've done in the bedroom, I'll simply say the French and waste no time humiliating you further. Everything you ever encounter or experience in this short, long life, you may thank or blame the French for. Take your pick. 2. But for God's sake, pity the French, will you? For they have no one to praise, no one to fault. They are doomed to the boredom of self-containment. When a Frenchman looks in the mirror, he sees no reflection, nothing whatsoever, for there's nothing to reflect upon. As the originator of all, he can only, as Descartes said more eloquently, be. A French woman can never experience the joy of being told she looks French, for that is a vile, or as the French say, vil redundancy, and holds no logic for the French mind. It's like kissing your own ghost and falling into an ethereal abyss of self-referential absurdity, which is, after all, typically French. All right, so as I said, I'm going to read from my book, God's Breath Hovering Across the Waters. So yeah, my mother passed away tragically, suddenly in 2009. And at the same time, I was working on a larger project that had to do with a bunch of different things, including, I always get these confused, astrology, In particular, Arno Penzias, who was a Nobel Prize winner, who was won for creating this cryogenic receiver that listened to outer space, and the sound that he heard, he determined to be the Big Bang, or the echo of the Big Bang, and that was proof of the Big Bang. So that's one thing that gets pulled in. The RCA dog with the image of the dog listening to the bighorn as well. So all these different sort of things, the RCA dog, the Soviet space dogs, all kinds of different things sort of got pulled in with my mother's death into this sort of whirlwind and then spun off into a bunch of different poems. So the first one I'm going to read is called The Mother's Song. And it's actually going to be, I was thrilled to learn, it's going to be on Poetry Daily in a couple weeks. The mother's song is the sound of the boot compressing the snow, the sound of the bayonet stabbing a bale of hay, the sound of a gunshot behind the barn, the sound of a spade edging into dry earth, the sound of a prayer muttered by the doomed penitent hiding behind a curtain, his mouth taped shut, his thumbs cut off, and a hole in his throat through which a thrush reaches out, a worm in its beak, blind and twisted as an ampersand a child practiced over and over in a black book as punishment for daring to imagine the mother's song that's written on torn white wings from the other side of understanding, where everything has a way of breathing and everything is as wondrous as waking up in rags on a forest floor, realizing that no one survived, not even those who live. Keep track of time here. Okay, so this one's called A Nebula, and I think it's self-explanatory, but I like to read it in Pennsylvania because it's all about Pennsylvania, so why not? A nebula. A nebula is a cloud of dust, gas, and plasma that may one day form stars and planets. A nebula is also a cloud-like spot on the cornea. How I ended up in Pennsylvania, I'll never fully understand. Pennsylvania has always been a nebula to me, a land of green John Deeres working like synchronized swimmers to make perfect crop circles, although come to think of it, my first love was from Pennsylvania. It was 1986, and I felt as if I were swimming in a cloud all day long. In 964, Al-Sufi spotted the Andromeda Galaxy but did not notice the prominent Orion Nebula, perhaps because of a nebula on his cornea. It took me 3 months in 2004, a time between living in one place in Pennsylvania and another place in Pennsylvania, to figure out my marriage was dead. In 1964, Pablo Picasso painted his fourth version of Head of a Bearded Man. He slept with many women, sometimes even his wife. When I moved out of the couch house we were renting on part of a horse farm, I grew a badass beard and dreamt of riding a motorcycle, but never did. I came to Pennsylvania once in 1987 to break up with my girlfriend, which I regretted for years. It's likely I've been blind many times in my life. Pennsylvania is my home now. I've married another Pennsylvania, and she is as strong as the state is wide. It seems I have a thing for them, Pennsylvanians. Although it has no beard, the sky in Pennsylvania sometimes hangs so low, I want to reach up and give a little tug to its big Amish chin. Let's see. Okay. This is called Cantico with Dashes of Remorse. True story, when I was a little kid, I wouldn't say I broke into the house next door, but it was open. It was actually being built. It was not completed, and I walked into it with another kid, and we just took all the building materials and the paints, and we mixed them together because that was really fun to do, and we painted the house, which I guess the owners of the house didn't like too much, and so this is the story. And I never told my mother about this. That's the other piece. A canticle with dashes of remorse. The mother in the movie Mother would kill for her son. Not so my mother, who, if anything went wrong, laid blame squarely on me. If a kid hit me, I probably deserved it. And why was I bothering about it anyway? How about hitting him back? That never worked out well for me. One kid boxed my ears and left no bruises, but a pain in my head so excruciating you'd think he was professionally trained in torture. 1,000 of me fell into myself, like swimmers choreographed to look like the petals of a closing flower. I confess that when I was 6, I snuck into the house they were building next door and painted the walls myself. I mixed pink insulation into several cans of paint and reached as high as a 6-year-old could to spread my personal vision across the newly built house. Still, I was surprised when the police came knocking at our door, asking to speak to my mother. I hid in the garage waiting to be turned in, envisioning life behind bars with prison slop on metal trays and clothes so baggy they practically dripped off. But no one called for me, not for questions or punishment. Not a word was mentioned, but there was plenty of talk around the neighborhood about who the vandals probably were and what they had done. I never told my mother, and eventually it seemed too silly to bring up at all. Would she even remember? But now, for some reason, I wish I could ask her if she protected me from the law that day, or if she just thought her little angel was incapable of the destruction I did so easily and dutifully, with hardly any effort at all. Okay, I'm going to read one longer poem, last poem though. It's not in 12 parts. It's kind of in a few parts, but you won't hear the parts because they're not numbered or anything. And it's called Theory of Evolution, and there are some Russian and German words which I will promise you I will butcher. So if anybody speaks those languages, please forgive me. And it's called Theory of Evolution, which was the name of a Volkswagen ad in the 1960s, which had a series of pictures of Volkswagens across. It's a very famous ad. You're nodding your head. I can say, do you know it? Yeah. If you've studied advertisement, I think it's one of the iconic ads. It's that famous. So there's a bunch of Volkswagens down the page on the left and right, and they're absolutely identical. And it says Theory of Evolution, Volkswagen. In other words, Volkswagen doesn't evolve, it doesn't change, and that's the beauty of it. It's exactly the same as it always was, but what the advertisement doesn't say is it was developed by the Nazis. It was a Nazi car, and you probably shouldn't be that proud about driving the exact same car that the Nazis drove. The other piece of this, which you'd know from previous poems by the time you got here, is that my mother was run over by a Volkswagen. And my mother is also a Holocaust survivor, so it's all so complicated, and I tried to get a little bit of that complication in here, along with some hopefully more amusing lines and some rhyming going on here too. Theory of Evolution. Everybody wanted a Volkswagen. Everybody loved a Volkswagen. Hitler demanded a Volkswagen, a car for everybody, or anybody who was worthy of a body, and the Deutsche Arbeitsfront, also created by Hitler, obliged. Hitler loved the Volkswagen. Everybody loved Hitler. Hitler was a Volkswagen, small and compact, full of simple ideas everyone could grasp. Ushered into power with 1/3 of the vote, Hitler soon became Germany's most beloved leader. Ein Volk, ein Reich, ein Führer. Everybody wanted a Hitler. Everybody loved a Hitler. Who wouldn't worship a broom that could sweep away all of life's detritus? The Treaty of Versailles, 2 eyes for an eye, Jews, gypsies, and communist spies. Germany created a Hitler, and in turn, Hitler created a Germany he could embrace without flinching. Here is a child's story in small, compact form. Hitler gave all the Jews stars, but the Jews did not feel special. They felt the opposite of special. They felt the dirt beneath their feet reaching up for their bones. They felt the dreadful weight of the world's silence, the birth of loneliness. My 5-year-old mother hardly knew she was a Jew. Her parents snatched her up and ran from the Reich, crossing the Molotov-Ribbentrop line into Stalin's cold, dank night. Everybody loved Stalin. They had no choice. They slid down the barrels of Tokarevs to give his mustache wet kisses. He pinched their cheeks until they cried, "Uncle, dear uncle." They loved him so much they worked themselves dead. They fell still and bloodless like branches of frozen larch on the Siberian steppes. After the war, my mother moved back to Poland, but Poland was a burning lake. Nobody loved Poland, not even the Poles. Germany had set it on fire and blasted it full of holes. Warsaw looked clean as the moon, with a face freshly scrubbed by embers and ash. Corpses smoldered in her eyes for years. Back in Deutschland, Volkswagen and Bayer spat out perfect little capsules for the masses, one for the inside, one for the out. On Ein Volk, Ein Reich, well, not quite. The war was over for the Krauts, and of course capitalism won out. Everybody still loved a Volkswagen. My mother moved to Canada in '58, but never wanted a Volkswagen. 51 years later, in her doctor's parking lot, a Volkswagen would do her in for good. Its great Prussian bulk, her small Jewish body, Panzer, versus cavalry, nothing spared. Deutsche Arbeitsfront's logo used to be a black swastika inside a black multi-pronged gear against a blood-red backdrop, mannish and beefy as a boot print, stomped into a corpse. The Volkswagen logo today is less controversial, a small V atop a big W, stressing the Wagen, not the Volk, Ein Volk. A chrome dragonfly resting its silver wings on the hood of a car before lifting off on its flight back to the fatherland. In the celebrated Theory of Evolution ad campaign, 5 rows of 3 identical beetles, each representing a different year's model, stack up neatly along a black and white page. The message: the world changes, but Volkswagen remains the same, defying the edicts of evolution, impervious to each passing decade, for which Adolf Hitler, Führer und Reichskanzler, is given little credit. The same charming, timeless creation, compact, tidy, and efficient. Thanks.
I think we have time for some questions. If, you guys have questions?
Should we just both stand up here and we can,
Yeah, sure.
we can talk?
Just put this stuff down.
Yeah.
When did you start getting into poetry? At what age?
Do you want to take it or do you want me to take it? How do you want to do it?
We'll both do it, so you go ahead.
So when I was in high school, I wrote really not very good poems all the time. But I didn't really, and then when I was in college, I took some creative writing classes, and I was interested in writing. I took a lot of English classes, I took a lot of history classes, I sort of did that kind of stuff. But I feel like, and all that time I was writing poems and I was interested in doing that, but I feel like the time that I really realized I was in a sustained kind of way interested in committing myself to writing poems was after I graduated college, when I had a 9-to-5 job and was punching a time card, and I was still writing poems. And at that point I felt like this was something that I might continue to do with some measure of seriousness. Does that? But I mean, I wrote my earliest poems when I was in junior high or high school. They just were terrible. But I think most high school kids write terrible poems if they write poems. So that's totally fine.
I can answer that too, I guess, if you want. Do you want to hear another answer?
Sure.
So I didn't write any poetry unless I had to in school. Until, well, no, I shouldn't say that. So in Canada, we have this which is where I'm from, where I grew up. We have this we don't anymore, but we used to have this crazy thing called grade 13, which wasn't a joke. It's not like the 13th floor or something that doesn't exist. It's actually a real year. It's the last year of high school. And in that year, as we had before, I was forced to write a poem by my English teacher. Not the first time, probably the fifth or sixth time that happened, but this is the first time that year. And something I was writing, and something just turned on in my brain. I don't know if you had this experience when you first write a poem. It's really like I don't know. I've only heard about heroin. I don't know about it personally. Okay, but I've heard that the first high is amazing, and then you're always chasing that high, and you can never get it again. That's the way poetry's been for me. I got this incredible high from writing this first poem, and I've been chasing that demon ever since. I don't get the same high, but I do get an echo of it at least. So after that, I was just addicted, and I kept writing through college, and then I actually started a PhD, and I found I was just writing too much poetry to continue, so I switched over to an MFA, and the rest is history.
Yeah.
I have a question for both of you. Charles Bukowski, I don't know if you've
Sure.
Yeah, he's my favorite poet, and he says that you should only write if it comes bursting out of you, right? So in terms of your work ethic as published authors for poetry, do you only write your poems when you're inspired, or do you sit down forcefully to write them? Do you say, I'm going to take an hour out of my day to write poems, or do you only write poetry when you feel it bursting out of you?
Want me to go first? Yeah. Yeah, I rarely feel that bursting thing anymore. I mean, sometimes, occasionally, it's more like you get a little tickle, and you can either ignore it or you can go with it. But I mean, you could see that with Charles Bukowski. It is kind of, he does sort of, everything is kind of the overflow of emotions, like Wordsworth said. But no, for me, I have to force myself to write. Often it's a violent struggle. It's not pretty. At least inside my head, it's not pretty. Yeah, and then I spend a lot of time, I'm sure Wayne does too, just crafting the poem. Yeah.
I think too, like what you're seeing is, there are a lot of different schools of thought about poems and a lot of different kinds of poetry writers, and I think that Bukowski is really kind of exuberant, expressive. To go back to the 50s, the term was often this sort of raw versus cooked idea of poems. Some poems were raw and some were cooked, right? And that was sort of typified by Frank O'Hara versus Robert Lowell. And Bukowski is clearly a kind of raw poet, and I think maybe to different degrees, but I think we're both more cooked poets than that. I think we're both crafters a little bit.
Yeah.
And so, for me, so I have a fiction writer friend who was asked once, sort of what do you like about writing on a panel, and he was up there with a bunch of writers, and the rest of them were sort of talking about how much they love the process of being creative and making things, and his response and I feel similar to this, he said, I hate writing. I don't find writing to be fun at all. I find it to be stressful. I find it to be difficult. I find it to be really sort of rage-inducing, but I really hate not writing more. And so, I often kind of feel that way. For me, the hardest part is to get a draft done. Once I have a draft, I love playing with it and honing it and narrowing it and revising it and sort of shaving it down to something that feels like I can't change another word in it. It's exactly the way it needs to be. That's a totally different kind of poet than the kind of poet who Bukowski is. And I think that's fine. I love Frank O'Hara, who's sort of in that school. He's one of my favorite poets, but he also is a very different kind of poet than I am.
Yeah. A metaphor I like to use with my students is it's sort of like mining. So you go in there, you got to get all the coal and everything out of there, and that's that first. That's the first draft. That's the writing, and you can't impose any of the craft ideas or you can't put any impositions on it. You just got to take all the dirt out of there, and then you're going to work on it and get the diamond out of the coal later. But so it's sort of a two-part process. But people like Bukowski, O'Hara, Ginsberg, and a few younger writers, like I know Matthew Lippman and a couple others, they have kind of the gift of gab, and their Cole has its own beauty. They don't need to play with it that much. They probably still do. Even Bukowski probably still plays with it somewhat, you know, but it at least feels like it's not been played with, like it just came out.
I was just gonna say, you both are writing about grief. You
Yeah.
know, grief a little bit removed in time,
Yeah.
but, do you find that form has really helped you, particularly when it was perhaps a little more raw? How does, you were talking a little bit about form there, how getting everything out and then shaping it. How has form helped you to rein in grief, each of you?
I don't know, that's a really interesting question. I'm not sure that it reins it in so much as I mean, this sounds like an obvious answer, but I don't intend it to, or even a glib answer, but I don't
Yeah.
intend it to feel that way. It sort of gives shape to it, right? I mean, I
Right,
think
yeah.
there's a way that, I mean, I think of myself, I'm not someone who writes a ton of formal poets in the sense of rhyming sonnets. I have, I think, exactly one rhyming sonnet, but I think that there's a way that it's, in my mind, all poetry is formal. We're constructing the experience of the language, the way it's timed, the way it operates visually. We're sort of shaping what the language does. I mean, I see poetry as performative that way, a sort of intimate performance through the page. And I feel like, so I'm not sure for me it's necessary. I mean, I think what I'm trying to say is that I think the grief itself is separate from the way the grief becomes performed in a poem. And form is essential to the way grief becomes performed in a poem. And I think that performing of it allows me to understand it and shape it. But I don't feel like, and this is very anti-Bukowski in this way, very non-Bukowski, I don't feel like I'm sort of putting myself on the page so much as I'm putting something that's crafted on the page that's in a kind of articulation of something. So there's a kind of removal there, and form is part of that shaping and removal, if that makes sense. I think that's what I think.
For me, this book in particular was kind of a departure from my other work, because this really came out of the grieving process, and a lot of it was kind of just me screaming into the void. And so it's the only form that I really gave this book, aside from that, maybe that one poem that I read, which is a little more formal, is just kind of making it consumable, creating it so it's just not for me, but for other people. I had to kind of tone it down and shape it a little bit. But for me, the part that was restorative to me was just the bawling, the screaming, and the rage that this came out of, that this originally came out of. Yeah. So the form, again, to answer your question,
Yeah.
the form part to me was just practical, because I couldn't possibly publish just me raging for 80 pages. That nobody would want to read that.
So I have another question.
Oh, one more.
So several of us are taking classes with Alan. For our creative writing class, we're starting poetry here shortly. And I certainly haven't written any poetry or anything that I would consider worthwhile reading. And I think several people are also new to it. So what advice do you have for people who are just kind of stepping into that new style of writing? What helped you guys when you were kind of getting more serious about it, focus, and produce better work than what you've been doing before?
That's a tough question.
Well, I can jump in.
Yeah,
Let
go
me
ahead.
say
Let
that
me
I
think
think that,
about it.
I think that, the old adage that good writers borrow, great writers steal, right? I think there's a way that when you're writing poems, there's a way to sort of turn your reading life, right? So obviously read a lot of poems while you're trying to write poems, and there's a way to turn your reading life into a kind of generating of assignments. So like, I always feel like when I read a poem, there's always something about it that strikes me as kind of like the engine of that poem. So there's something that's sort of creating the torque inside that poem. And so if you can figure out what that thing is, then I always feel like that's the thing I want to steal. So maybe it's that, wow, this poem seems to be getting a lot of torque out of the way it's using tercets, 3-line stanzas, right? those 3-line stanzas seem to keep me off rhythm because, you know, I don't know, this poet has decided not to have a period at the end of any stanza. So all the stanzas sort of float into each other and there's not a definitive place to stop. And that floating quality seems to be, I'm imagining an abstract poem, seems to be the thing that is making this poem really sort of come off the page and feel like it's powerful. Or here's a poem that is a 1-sentence poem and it creates this kind of long, headlong quality where I can't stop reading because the poem just keeps propelling me forward, right? I mean, those are two different things that are kind of engines in particular kinds of poems. So I'm actually imagining specifically a Mark Doty poem and a Rick Barrett poem. And so if you look at that, then you say, wow, that's a really cool kind of engine that's driving this poem. I want to write a poem that stops every line, or a poem that is 1 sentence, or a poem that, you know, so you sort of think like, in your reading life, start writing down things that you see other poets do that seem interesting to you, even if you can't quite articulate why they seem interesting, and then use those things as assignments, right? Does that make sense? Like, I think the hardest thing, at least for me as a poet, is sort of, you know, the blank page and feeling like I don't have something to, there's not a door there to open to sort of climb inside the poem. And I think if you just have one little idea, one thing that you're lifting from something else, that often gives you a door. And then you can climb in and start doing some work. You know what I mean? I know other people don't have that experience. You know, they can sort of endlessly fill a blank page, but that's not how I work.
Well, I think what you're saying, Wayne, is you're really sort of targeting or pinpointing the sort of poet's anxiety, because I know every time I look at a page, it's like, well, whatever I write has to be better than this blank page. And that's kind of a high bar, because a blank page is really kind of awesome just on its own. It's a blank slate, and you can do anything, and you don't want to ruin it with your words. So that's such a anxiety, I think, for a lot of us. But if I understood your question correctly, you were saying, like, you've never written poetry. How would you start, like, writing a poem out of nowhere? And I agree with Wayne. Reading is really key. Yeah. Just read. And if you feel even that tiny, just try to be sensitive to that tiny itch of inspiration and take it. Mm-hmm. You like a word, run with it. Write your poem. You know, you're reading and you like a word, just go with that word. You know, just try to be sensitive to anything. Do you write prose? Is that what you're like more? You're more into prose or non-fiction, or what have you guys done so far?
Yeah, we worked on short stories mostly.
And how was that for you?
For me, I've been doing that for a few years now, but I think generally people really enjoy it.
Well, maybe if you really love short stories, take a look at some poets like Russell Edson, Sabrina Remarque, drawing blank. There's got to be a few. Well, Claudia Rankin, right? Yep. Look at some poets who actually write in prose, and see what they do, and ask yourself, why is this poetry not prose? What's the difference? And maybe take it from there. I mean,
that's good advice.
Yeah, and I guess least of all, don't worry that it's not going to be good enough, or that you're not worthy, or that it's like, don't have any. Just write down anything. I find if I write, even if that ends up getting thrown away, that's not a wasted day. As long as I'm writing, that's somehow leads you. It's all part of the same process. And you might find you hate writing poetry. You're not happy with any of your poems, but then you go back to writing short stories and you go, oh, I actually learned something that I'm bringing into my short stories. You know, they're all connected.
I would say too, in Triggering Town, which is sort of one of the books on sort of writing poetry, Richard Hugo's book, Triggering Town, he has this great section where he sort of lays out what he thinks are, and it's very tongue-in-cheek. He's saying, here's the way to write poems. Always use a number 2C pencil, or whatever it is. Always use this one particular brand of notebook. Always write, and what he's obviously saying, by a certain point it becomes obvious, is he's not saying that you have to do exactly the things that he does, but whatever it is about writing with prose, with poetry, whatever it is that you feel drawn to write, don't be shy about being a total freak about it. If you decide that you really, really need this one kind of notebook and you have to do this thing and somehow that helps you, you know, in your process, do that. I mean, I will only write first drafts on a piece of paper folded in half. I do not know why I do that, but I will only do that. And at a certain point, I just decided that's what I do.
And if you're stuck on that first poem, take one of your short stories and just pull out little lines and try to create a poem out of it. And it's just, then you got your first poem out of the way.
Or
Yeah.
one scene, just
Not a
explode a
virgin
scene
anymore.
into a lyric moment.
We don't have to have that anxiety
Yeah.
anymore.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Did you have another
Well,
question?
the other question, you're both editors, and
Mhm.
how has that, what are the good parts of editing for your writing, and what are the bad parts? And how does that sift through?
So we edit a little differently. I edit a journal, he edits a book press, so that there are different experiences, and I've worked a little bit at a book press, but not nearly as extensively. So, you know, I'll talk about journal editing.
And
I-
one more thing, I
yeah.
have some students in here, I think. and,
Yeah.
What things, tips that you might have for them in getting some pieces out, and just trying,
For publishing or editing?
public,
For
Yeah.
publishing?
So I can take that, that one's
Or-
really
or-
easy.
yeah.
Just start sending out.
oh, yeah, exactly.
And here's the trick. Start sending out when you know you're gonna get rejected. And then it's not anxiety inducing. You send out and know that you're gonna get rejected for a few years. If you have some bad poems now, send them out and get them back and get used to the process of getting rejected, because even the most famous writers are getting rejected. Rejection is a part of being a writer, and it's good to just get comfortable with that out of the gate. And then when something gets picked up, it's nice. But you also, you know, or do something that takes the edge off rejection. I mean, my colleague Kevin Proofer used to had an empty glass lamp in his office that he had filled with all of his rejection slips. This is back when he used to get paper rejection slips. You know, I mean, just a lot of it is just overcoming that anxiety of rejection. Rejection doesn't mean anything necessarily. You know, who knows what's happening behind the scenes? Who knows what cranky screener read your work in a really bad mood and barely looked at it because they were just super cranky that day. You have no idea what happened on the other side of that. And then when something comes back, revisit it. Read it for yourself. Read it aloud to yourself and say, okay, did this get rejected because I need to work on it? Or did this get rejected because some cranky editor was in a bad mood?
Or it wasn't the right fit?
Or it just wasn't the right fit, or it's not aesthetically what they're looking for, or whatever. And every time I get a piece rejected, I feel like that's a good time to revisit and to think about it. And often I decide, nope, they're wrong, it's good. Or, oh, they're right, it is not good. You know, or, oh, the first half of this is working, but I can see how the ending is actually failing in some way, and I see why this got rejected. In terms of what editing does for writing, I think that, I think that the downside is that you spend a ton of time wading through giant piles of manuscripts. We receive between 10 and 15,000 poems a year, and you know, we publish about 80 pages of poetry a year. So to think about rejection, you can see how, a lot of the work we reject is terrific and publishable. We just get far too much work. So that's a lot of work, and it draws on some of the same kind of energy that writing takes. And in that way, it's frustrating sometimes because you feel that it's drawing away from this sort of finite amount of energy that you have. But the plus side is that, I think of journals in particular as sort of, if like literature is a ship, they're like the prow. There's like the stuff that's most current. People are just writing and just sending out the door. They haven't even compiled it yet. And that's really exciting, especially when I get work from writers who I like their work, I know their work a little bit, and you see this new exciting work and you say, this is really great, I'm really excited about this. You feel like you have a little bit of a finger on sort of the very current moment in our literature. And I think that's really exciting, and I really find that energizing. And so, it really goes both ways. It's both draining and energizing, depending on the day. But it is a creative act, making a journal, making a press, doing these things, and in that way it has the potential to sort of steal from your creative life, your other creative life as a writer.
Yeah, I guess, there are really sort of two aspects to editing. One is the acceptance, rejection part, which I guess when you're in the business of accepting and rejecting, you can probably understand why your work gets accepted or rejected. So I agree completely with Wayne. The other part of editing, and I think we probably do that more in translation work, because translation is very editing heavy, I find anyway.
Yeah.
It's very much, it's creative copy editing, really. And doing that, it's just, it's honing the skill of editing your own work too, just being, scrutinizing every word, every line break, everything, It's very easy to do to other people, but it's much harder to do to yourself. So the more you do it for other people, the more you can sort of learn to apply it to yourself. So I think it's very helpful. And as far as publishing, you're talking about undergrads or grads?
Well, I've just been encouraging students to send stuff out and just try it, so probably not
Yeah.
publishing
I
a whole book.
Yeah, I might. You're talking about publishing individual poems.
Individual poems.
Yeah, I might differ a little
Yes,
bit
those
with
are-
Wayne on this one. I don't know if I would recommend sending to journals where you're going to be rejected. I understand what you're saying, but I would send to university journals. I would send to, like, does Villanova have a journal?
Yes, they do.
So I would send to them, and I would send to other journals, look up other journals that sort of specialize in student work. The danger of sending it to sort of a national journal is, well, you might actually be accepted, and then you might regret having that published in 10 years, because you really are in a learning phase.
Well, but I would say that if you have a poem picked up by the New Yorker, that's great for you. And I think that, you're developing your work. I also think there's a kind of risk in shooting too low. I see a lot of poets who end up, over time, they've accumulated this massive publication in journals that are not that hard to get into.
Once you've sort of,
once
why I asked if you were graduate or undergraduate.
Oh, yeah,
'cause I would
okay, I
say
see what
for
you're saying,
graduates,
yeah.
I would completely agree with you.
Yeah.
For undergraduates, I don't know. I wouldn't want to completely discourage you, or have you feel completely discouraged by all the rejection, because there is so much rejection. You have to get a thick skin. You have to really. A lot of people I went to grad school didn't survive in the writing business, not because they weren't great writers. They were certainly as good as me or better, but they didn't have the stamina or the skin to take all that rejection. There's just a lot of rejection, and that's for poetry, fiction, anything, nonfiction, whatever you do, right? I mean, do you have a percentage on Coppernickel, how much you take?
We accept less than 1%.
Less than 1%. I thought it was like 5%, but less than 1%.
Yeah.
That's low odds, right? But so I wouldn't want to discourage you too much as an undergrad.
Yeah, I guess what I'm trying to say is that by sending out, don't send out work you don't believe in, but also be totally prepared for it to get rejected. I'm trying to just give you a sense of we're really saying the same thing, getting used to this idea that you will be rejected. You'll be rejected a lot. Even if you're incredibly brilliant, you will still be rejected a lot. And that you just have to get used to that process. And that builds stamina, hopefully. Because I think Henry's totally right, that stamina is essential. I've seen a lot of really talented writers get discouraged simply because they are discourageable, and you kind of have to be able to say no. Like, I'm not going to be discouraged by my 40th rejection. I'm going to keep working and honing the work and developing it and building it. And
I think when I started to send out, I'm sorry.
Yeah, no.
I think when I started to send out, at some point, maybe a year or two into starting to send out, I said, okay, I'm giving myself a 15-minute limit on moping after I get a rejection.
Yeah.
And I would literally time it, and after 15 minutes, I could not talk about it, worry about it, but I gave myself that 15 minutes to grieve. And then, as Wayne said, go back to the poem. Is it the poem? Is there something I can do to improve it? You don't want to cater to someone else's taste, but you want to say, well, maybe there's something obvious here that I'm not seeing.
Yeah. Here's a nuts
Or
and
maybe it's
bolts
not.
thing I would say too. If you are a young, unpublished poet, you're going to do better sending your work to journals where there is one editor making choices, or maybe two, rather than sending to, say, a graduate student edited journal where a panel of graduate students is making decisions, because I think that one editor is more likely to take a risk on someone who's not a name than 5 editors agreeing to take a risk on someone who's not a name.
But how do you know? Like, so many journals, they don't list
Yeah.
their you know, that they have you know, they just say they have one or two editors, but they might have a room of interns.
They do sometimes. They have a room of readers, but the final decision is, you know, so like if you send a poetry magazine, which I think a lot of people are afraid to send to because it's such a prestigious magazine, but I know a lot of people who their first publications were in there, because finally you just have to convince one reader, gets passed on, and then convince a final editor, rather than convincing a room of graduate students who I think are less likely to admit that an undergrad might be a better poet than they are, right? You know, I think that is a potential risk of sending to those journals that might seem like they're a little easier because they're edited by younger people, right? It seems a little counterintuitive is what I'm trying to say, but I think that there's some truth to that. And early, when I was a graduate student, almost all of my first publications were in places that were not graduate student edited. So maybe that was just luck or the way it happened, but I feel like there's some measure of truth to that.
That's interesting. So are you teaching a poetry class?
I am next semester right now, I'm doing
Are you-
literature classes.
Okay,
And
so
I'm
no-
a poet, so recently I've gotten a lot of students writing really great creative nonfiction, and I think that's a little bit more open than fiction and poetry
It
in
is
some
more
ways.
open.
And there's a lot of stuff on the web that's actually pretty interesting, especially things that are place related, like
Mhm.
Ecotone and
Yeah.
Terrain.org, and there's a new one I just saw on Poets and Writers called Terrestrial or something like that.
I've seen that, yeah.
And, I don't know, one of the goals of our department is to try and get a couple of students, you know, to try and send stuff out, so I thought I would ask to see what you said, but that's a really interesting point about a one editor, one or two people versus having to get through a whole committee. That's,
Enough people in a committee can, you know, it just takes a majority to tank you in a committee.
In the same way, a committee probably isn't going to find the best work, because
Yeah.
the best work is not work that they're all going to agree on.
Right, yeah.
Or unlikely, I should say.
Well, that's why we have 3 poetry editors at Coppernickel, but we have a system of passion votes to try to cut against that, because we know that we don't always think that we should be picking work that we all agree on, so sometimes we passion vote things in. I think we get a certain number per issue.
That's great.
I don't think we know what the
that's a
number
great
is,
concept.
That's a
because
great
we've
idea.
never really
Passion.
pushed up against someone feeling like they passion voted too many times, but,
That's a
'cause I
great
think
idea.
yeah.
I think we're out of time. So
Okay,
thank
thank
you
you.
both very much.
Wonderful. Thanks
Thanks.
you all for coming.